Pleased to be joined today by a co-creator of Dark Side of the Ring, Evan Husney. Evan, welcome to Under the Ring Pro Wrestling Conversations. Thanks for being with me today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Phil. I appreciate it.
So the new season is kicked off. When this drops, we'll already be ahead of the second episode of the new season. Which story excites or interests you the most about the new season?
Oh man, there are several. I absolutely, well, the premiere episode, Chris and Tammy, is a super important episode to me personally. It's one that we have always wanted to do for the show ever since the very first season, and tried to make it happen on numerous occasions, and we finally pulled the trigger going into season 4. And Chris Candido, was a wrestler that meant a lot to me growing up as a kid. I was a huge ECW fan, and seeing Chris Candido on the triple threat was just so awesome. The power bomb off the top rope is just one of the most amazing finishing moves ever. And I feel like Chris Candido is pretty unsung in the wrestling world today. I think if he were around today, I think he'd be a huge influential force. I think he was very much ahead of his time. His size and his style is much more now more commonplace than it was back in his time. So it's been important for me to always want to show a spotlight on him. And the story in of itself about these two very young kids who got swept up into the wrestling business at a very, very young age. They were, impressionable, very innocent, and they kind of got gobbled up by, a very heavy painkiller drug party excess time period in wrestling. And I think how they started and how they wound up is pretty shocking. And the episode is definitely a roller coaster ride in terms of Chris passing away at a very young age. And of course, Tammy, aka Sunny, from the WWF, in her current legal situations, facing a manslaughter charge and things like that. It's a pretty wild experience. And so that story to me was always a very important one for us to tell. And I have to also say the other one, there's a lot that I'm very excited about. Bam Bam Bigelow is another just all-timer for me, one of my favorite wrestlers growing up as a kid. And we basically approach this episode as, I don't even care what the story is about Bam Bam Bigelow. We're just going to do a Bam Bam episode. We'll find a story. And in meeting his family and meeting his kids and, his ex-wife and everything, the story just came alive, and they're just incredible on camera. And I think a lot of fans are going to be shocked to learn a lot about, his sort of final years, for sure.
Why do pro wrestling stories lend themselves so well to documentary filmmaking?
That's a good question. I think, well, the lifestyle of professional wrestlers are just so over the top and wild and extreme, in terms of just the whether it's the like rock and roll lifestyle or just it is kind of mirrors that rock and roll experience, being on the road, touring, partying, excess, but I think what makes it special is that wrestlers have always had to live two lives. One, maintaining their characters, protecting the business, keeping up kayfabe, keeping up appearances, trying to play a heel when they're a completely different person at heart. And I think somewhere along the way, some of them lose sight of who they are, deep down. And I think that there's this real crisis of identity. There is a very interesting blurred lines between reality and fiction. It just lends itself to great dramatic storytelling. And they're also great storytellers. They're great at promos, and just they're larger than life characters. Especially wrestlers from earlier eras, from the 70s and 80s and early 90s and stuff. So I think it lends itself for that reason, because there's no other real sport I can think of, or any other form of entertainment, where you have the performers having to toe that line between a constant performance of who they are and who they are in real life. I think that's very unique with wrestling.
A criticism I have from the news side, because that's my background, sometimes I watch documentaries and I find differences in the creative license that they tend to have while telling stories that I might not be afforded while presenting something as a news story.
Yeah.
And with wrestlers, like you said, you're dealing with people sometimes who might be working all the time and might stretch the truth. You're dealing with people who might be bad faith actors, and you're dealing with people who just might have bad memories too. So how do you kind of deal with that and balance it all out as you seek to have something that's both a good documentary and one that's based in fact?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I have unique viewpoints on, documentary filmmaking, and how it relates to journalism. I kind of I take a different path where, I think at the end of the day, for us making documentaries, it's not necessarily about just presenting fact. I think there is a lot, in terms of construction to, make these stories as dramatic as possible, and to, be truthful to the story, not to like take, liberties with the truth per se. But I think it's more than just presenting the facts. Um, Also, on top of that, I think when we started out doing this show, and we had no experience working with wrestlers, and outlining some of those things you said about,
Yeah.
bad memory, and, working you and bending the truth and lying and all that stuff. We were really new to that in terms of working with wrestlers. And I think there was a lot of frustration that came out with us in the edit room, trying to separate those things and to try to make them, try to figure out, what is separating fact from fiction. And then we sort of understood that there is a whole separate like meta layer to all this, which is that is part of wrestling. Part
Yeah.
of wrestling is the subversion of truth, and working, how wrestlers and the audiences are kind of in this, they kind of work in tandem, with each other to perpetuate these kind of, fantasy falsities, and that's kind of the magic of it. And I think, all wrestlers are in business for themselves, man. They all want to protect their spots, which is another unique quality to wrestling. And so I think it's something that started to us that was a little frustrating to figure out. I think we just had to eventually lean into and to kind of communicate that is a part of it. And we wanted to show audiences that was a part of it. So I think over the course of the show, you definitely see, when people are not being truthful, or when two different perspectives don't add up. We tend to show both, and we love the feeling in a documentary when you're presented with all these various different POVs, and you're then presented with different opinions, and then it's kind of left in your hands as the audience at the end to kind of look at it all and see how do you relate to it, and how do you think about all this, and what do you think about all this. I think that's always been something we've tried to be conscious of along the way.
I really appreciate that answer. It's just something where I've had problems with documentaries at times, and friends have told me, like, "No, you're holding it to the wrong standard, buddy." And I'm like, "Well, I'm sorry. It's how I was trained. But I
Y-
apologize, but like, it's just even Andre the
you know
Giant's
what's interesting?
documentary, I had problem with, in ways.
Y- yeah, you know what really opened, what's a good story on that, just real quick,
Yeah,
of
go
just
ahead.
how my head works with this, or how I kind of landed on, I guess, my own philosophy is, the great filmmaker, documentarian filmmaker Werner Herzog, if you're familiar. He had a great anecdote about the differences between journalism and documentary filmmaking that I've always kept in mind with anything I do, is talking about truth. This idea that the Manhattan phone book, okay, is the book of books if you're measuring by truth, right? It's John Smith. Yes, John Smith. He lives at this address. This is his phone number. Yes, yes, yes. That is true. But the way to approach the documentary about John Smith is, okay, yep, John Smith is his name. This is his phone number. This is his address. But what are his nightmares? What are John Smith's nightmares? And that's how we approach documentary filmmaking, is getting into that extra
Yeah.
layer. Yeah.
Just
Off topic.
it's just fun to talk about it, and it's not often that I'm
Yeah.
going to be able to have that kind of an exchange with somebody either. Because I interview wrestlers a lot too. So
Right.
going behind the scenes a bit, like I said, it fascinates me as somebody with my background, the work that goes into some of these pieces. What does it look like, soup to nuts? How the ideas for topics come about, to
Mhm.
actually shooting the episodes, and even fact checking some of this stuff.
Sure. Yes. So, well, it's definitely evolved over the seasons. Our team has expanded. Our team has gotten bigger. There's a lot of other producers now that are part of it, which is great, to have more help. But I guess like how a season is put together nowadays is we all kind of had these meetings where we bat around a lot of different stories. Some that we've been holding on to for a while, some that we have a lot of personal interest in, like Bam Bam Bigelow, as I was saying, is a good example of that. And we just kind of bat it around and kind of see what would it look like? Who would you get? What's the story? How does it break down in an hour? Like, okay, well, we can take the people on this ride and this, the first act, and then the third act is going to be here, and that's going to be getting into this part of it. And then how do we leave people? What's the ending? And we sort of just kind of sketch out what it would look like, and we kind of take them all under consideration. And some of them, they could be great stories, but we just don't have that firsthand information available to us, whether we know someone is going to turn us down immediately, or we don't have access to it, or there's too many WWE people that we know won't be able to be a part of our show, or for other reasons, whatever the other reasons are. Or maybe the story just isn't like gonna hold for a full hour. It would be a great 20 minutes, but it might not be a great hour. And so we just kind of bat those around, and we take a lot of suggestions from fans, from viewers of the show. I mean, we do a lot of social media posts about it. What do you guys want to see? And there's been a lot of episodes that fans have suggested that we've really taken seriously, maybe things we never would have done on our own. And it's led us down some weird rabbit hole. And then we find out that, hey, now it's an episode. And that's a lot of fun too. So we game out lots of different episodes over the course of the beginning of a season, even during the season. So we do that. And then the next process is just access. Like, who can we get to talk about it? We want to make sure we have enough firsthand voices. We don't want to be a show where there's, second and third hand information, or like, too many historical talking head voices or anything like that. And then if we can get like, family on board and some wrestlers on board, then it starts to become more real. And then we start, booking plane tickets and hitting the ground pretty much immediately, because we have a pretty demanding production schedule. That always is the pressure of everything, is this schedule. We're always pressured by the schedule no matter what. And then once we get all the interviews and we start to kind of sort out how we're going to unfold the story, how we're going to bring people in, and we're always keeping in mind the audience that's not a major hardcore wrestling audience. We're always trying to make the show accessible to people beyond that. So we're always mindful of like, how can we let people into this very insular world and they can understand everything and all that. And so there's that. And that's a big part of the craft of editing it, in terms of just like how it unfolds, and of course being faithful to, the story as we got it, from the people's voices. And then we start plugging in reenactments and we start bringing those to life. And then we have our composer compose some, banging tracks for it. And then we put it all together and make it sing at the last second. And then it's delivered probably 2 weeks before it airs.
Wow. And really the audience is such an important part of this too. It's just, even when I was conceiving this podcast, I wanted it more to be interesting conversations with interesting people, not necessarily, oh, this is a wrestling podcast. It's just because honestly, wrestlers are some of the most interesting people I've ever talked to. So it just made sense for me to do that. But it kind of leads me to something else I was going to go to is it frustrating to maybe have a really great story about someone fans just might not be that familiar with, and therefore it becomes lower in interest for them?
Totally. I mean, there are a lot of those names actually in the upcoming season here. And we've had them in the past too, where they are deeper cut names. Maybe they didn't reach the heights of, the WWF, or, there weren't action figures made of them. They weren't in video games, and there's not nostalgia for those characters. But regardless, they have just amazing stories. They have, fascinating histories and lives they've led. And we've always, ever since the very first season, kind of disregarded the notion of trying to keep it like super, pop culture driven, or like, only telling stories about the most famous people. Like season 1 has some pretty deep cut names in it, in that first season. And, to us, we always led with just what is the best story. And I'm very grateful that we've built an audience enough to be able to continually do that, and it not work, people not to show up. I think people, wrestling fans, the most hardcore, I mean, they know everything about these big names, but there's a lot of those like deeper cut names, like a Johnny Canine we did an episode about, or a Herb Abrams, or a Gino Hernandez, or something, or like upcoming we have Adrian Adonis or Matt Bourne, or names like that, or the Graham family, that they're willing to take that ride because they don't know anything about it, and they hopefully trust that with us doing it, that it's definitely going to be a captivating story.
Adonis is somebody I'm really looking forward to from this season. He's somebody who was very
Yeah.
big when I started getting into wrestling. So, and you
Mm-hmm.
don't hear a lot about his story too much because he's been gone for so long.
I know. Yeah.
The Graham family, I was wondering too with that one. That's Eddie and Mike.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Have you ever considered Dr. Jerry?
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, he's a part of it too.
Interesting.
He's a part of the episode too. I mean, the Graham family episode, again, it goes back to season 1, man. A lot of these do. It's so funny. And now we're getting around to doing a lot of the ones that we considered all the way in the beginning. The Graham family was suggested to us by Dutch Mantel, like right in the beginning when we were working on the show, is like, you have to do it because it's this unbelievable story about it's a tragic, very, very tragic story about like 4 different generations of Grahams. I mean, their real name is the Gossett family.
Right.
So, but it's 4 generations of them that had where they've taken their own lives, and it's very dark. And I think with this episode, we look at, obviously how brilliant Eddie Graham was as a promoter, one of the most, innovative minds wrestling has ever seen. I mean, influenced Vince McMahon. I mean, he was the guy. I mean, Eddie Graham. And I think his suicide shocked the wrestling world, in a huge, huge, huge way. But I think also at the same time, he comes from a lineage of suicide even before him, which is crazy. But I think his decision to take his own life made it sort of an excuse, or not, I'm sorry, not an excuse. It made it a viable option for his family, for other family members. And you start to learn how his son, who was a wrestler, Mike Graham, took his own life. Mike's son took his own life. And it's just this never-ending, like, hereditary, like, tragedy. And what I think is going to be eye-opening for a lot of viewers is not just the history of the Grahams, but also, Eddie Graham's granddaughter, Nicole, and her just super, super powerful interview where she really talks about she's the one who's going to break this cycle, in her family, and through, raising awareness, and promoting, more of the mental health and being more open, about feelings and things like that. And the episode is called Breaking the Cycle, the Graham Dynasty. So that's where the name, comes from. I mean, she literally is the one to break the cycle. So yeah, it's a heavy, heavy, heavy story, but also comes with it a lot of fascinating history about, really some of the more influential figures. And Dr. Jerry Graham. I mean, that's where Eddie Graham got his name, Dr. Jerry Graham. And, he's definitely a beacon of jaw-dropping stories as well, too.
Yeah, he's his own episode at some point. I think it's, if that's ever possible. But so much time has passed too. Do you feel like, when you look at some of the contents of your episode, you mentioned some of the, the really deep stuff you have with the Grahams, you have the Von Erichs, and then you have so many people with so many substance issues. You look back at the Herb Abrams one, the Chris Candido one you mentioned. Is it difficult to kind of toe that line of, you don't want to celebrate questionable behavior, you don't want to maybe ridicule people that need help, but then at the same time, like, it's all part of the warts of what their story is?
Yeah, I think it is a part of that era. Thankfully it's not that now. There is that silver lining that now things are different, than they were. I mean, there's different challenges and now that there were, but the sort of drug use and the concept of just the availability of these pharmaceuticals, it's mostly the pharmaceuticals that are really the problem, right? The oxys and the muscle relaxers, the somas,
right?
Obviously, and there is obviously the narcotic stuff too, for sure. But it was that era where these wrestlers were just on the road 300 plus days a year, their bodies breaking down. They're pretty much in car accidents every single night. And it's just, there's that one moment where, someone offers you something to get you to the next town, and then 1 turns into 6, and a couple weeks later, and then it turns into 12. And, it's just this cycle, right? And it's a common thread. It's a common thread among a lot of the stories that they end in this similar way, and where wrestlers fall into these traps, and so on and so forth. And I think that there is also, with respect to most of the male wrestlers, of course, there's this sense of machismo, and being, I think, the way society was and those generations were to be so closed off about your emotions, and to be so like tough. And I think wrestling has that facade of being muscular and tough and all that stuff. And I think a lot of people swallowed a lot of their traumas and a lot of their emotions, and that also leads to disaster. And that's a common thread you see among a lot of the other episodes too. And so I think this show, I think, allows, rather than like it being an expose, here's the warts of wrestling and the bad stuff. I think it's these are important things to talk about, and they're
Yeah.
important things to learn from. And I think wrestling did a very good job of hiding all that for so long, or trying to hide it. Like Chris Benoit's story swept under the rug. Owen Hart quickly, put to the side. And I think it didn't allow for a lot of people to like properly process these things that are happening, from fans and from wrestlers too. And I think the way we hope to approach our show, or the way we hope our show is looked at, is a way to process those, and to give some closure to some of these stories that have kind of, lingered on for so long in an unhealthy way. That's our
And some
hope.
some of the sweeping it, some of the moving the stories away is sort of part of the work too. You look back, and even Gina Hernandez dies, and they have to kind of present it within character on the TV show and explain kind of how people feel about it. Even then,
Exactly. It's got to go back.
In the coffin, it was sort of the same thing.
It's got to go back to the narrative. The narrative's the most important. The storyline's the most important. Yeah, no, exactly. And yeah.
Do you feel like dealing with the more modern generation now? Because obviously you do with social media, and also with some of the people you have on the show. Do you feel like things have gotten better overall? Do you think like it's because I feel like it's kind of a mixed bag still.
I agree with you. I totally agree with you. I think that, man, the social media era, I think, has been bad for wrestling in
Yes.
general. It's taken a lot of the magic away, I think, from wrestling. And but I do think there are better habits that most of the wrestlers are into now. I think, like, the fact that for example, like, that cannabis is more accepted is a good thing, in
Right.
wrestling, where there's alternative uh ways to combat pain than there ever have been. I think that is better, generally, and that's what you see. And the extracurricular activities of most wrestlers seem to be a little better than they were before. But yeah, I think the magic of wrestling has suffered a great deal from just the modern culture. And it kind of is weird to me, because it's like I see fans fixate. It's hard to explain to a normal person. It really is. But that
Yes.
fans are fixated so much on the decisions of the people behind the scenes writing these storylines than they are losing themselves in the wrestling, which is what the whole point is. But also the writers aren't doing a very good job of letting us lose ourselves in the magic of wrestling either,
Right.
So it's become this very meta, weird exercise that I don't quite understand. And it doesn't feel right to me, like, it doesn't feel like, it feels like something new. It feels like we're squabbling over, like, the way things are presented and the way, then, like, how they should achieve for ratings. It's just a weird metric that people are evaluating wrestling today that actually has nothing to do with the wrestling, I feel like. Do you know what I mean?
I do, and it's funny because I've been like an internet fan for like, oh god, like 25 years now, probably. So like
Yeah.
I can enjoy the shows independently of what I think about what the decision making is. Like I can
Yeah.
separate those pretty easily, but I think a lot of people have a
Yeah.
hard time doing that. And um,
Yeah.
one thing I
Yeah.
was going to ask you is, how do you deal with the criticism from people who say, okay, well, this is the dark side of the ring.
Mhm.
Where's the light side of the ring? And would you argue by showing the dark side, you're kind of allowing the good side to
Yeah,
show through anyway?
absolutely. Yeah. How, it's how can you appreciate the light side without the dark, man,
Yeah,
um, but yeah, I mean, look, like, the name and the branding, I think, is the thing that triggers the most negativity towards the show, which I totally understand. I think hindsight 2020, maybe go back in the time machine, maybe there was a better name, for the show or something. that might have helped to kind of just establish that I think what this show is really trying to do is less about digging the dirt up, and it's more about humanizing these wrestlers, because these wrestlers that we grew up idolizing, we looked at them as larger than life figures. We looked at them as, these action figure characters, superheroes, that were unfathomable. But that's not true. Behind the scenes, they're real people that we can actually relate to. And I think because wrestling, the way it's been portrayed in media for so long, is that media has always looked down on it and has always sort of looked at it as, oh, here's this fake, phony, thing. Why, it's laughable, it's fake, who cares, type thing. And I think for us, like, we really wanted to try to elevate the perception of wrestling, ironically, to show the real stakes and the real humanity of this and what they go through and what it is all about, so people can see them as real human beings like never before. That was kind of the real point of it, and I think that's been lost with modern wrestling fans too. I think fans have this weird hybrid association with their favorite wrestlers as if they really know them deep down, but they don't know them, who they are. And I think we wanted to really try to show these wrestlers as people. And there's also a perception. One last thing. I'm not trying to dig on wrestling fans too much, but there is this one thing too where it's like, I think there's this preconceived notion that's been ingrained in fans and wrestlers about the perception of wrestling is either putting it over or burying it. It's a black and white sort of very binary sort of thing, and I don't think that the way we approach it, and we do approach it from, being fans, we love this, right? But it's not about being so black and white, and it's not about judging anybody. It's not about like, this is wrong and this is bad and this is good, and we're putting this person over and we're burying this person over here. It's just about the story. This is the story of what happened. This is the real story about what happened. And I think a lot of people get swept up into the idea that these are supposed to be, our episodes are supposed to be commercial vehicles or something, or, maybe other documentaries that are out there on other networks are,
Sure.
And like ours are supposed to fall into that, but they're not. These are just the stories.
Yeah, and it's good to not have the attachment of the company with it too. Although, like you said
Right.
before, it creates some obstacles for you for access and that kind of thing. But
Yes.
it's good to have that independent view. And I will say that your characterization of wrestling in media pretty much mirrors the last 16 years of me pitching wrestling stories. So in mainstream media. So yeah, it's hard to get people to believe in them, and they don't get past the surface level of, oh, that's just that crap. Well, it's again, like I said before, it's interesting stories of interesting people. So
it is.
How different was it working on Tales from the Territories than Dark Side of the Ring?
Man, it was awesome. It was like, we had been grinding for so long on Dark Side at that point. We had been working pretty much nonstop since 2016 on the show. And I will admit that there was a little fatigue on just, covering the tragic, there was for me, in terms of just it has a wear on you, like emotionally, too.
I've been there.
Yeah, right. I mean, because we care about these people in these episodes and stuff, and it's hard not to. Even, you're maybe not supposed to, as a filmmaker, journalist, supposed to have that distance, but it's hard. And so yeah, it definitely took a toll on me, and things got pretty controversial at the end of the third season, and it was just like, even though we had been developing Tales from the Territories for literally about 2 years prior to it, maybe even more, it finally came together where, Vice picked it up and the deals were done, and we kind of figured out what we were going to do with it. And it was more just about like a vehicle to get out all of these really crazy short form stories of the road that we had heard and picked up along the way, but we had no real outlet for. And also kind of looking at like that territory generation, is not getting any younger, and it
Yeah.
was kind of an opportunity to try and just get some people together. And it was so fun, man. I mean, the pandemic had been in full swing, and a lot of people, there weren't wrestling cons or ways for these wrestlers to kind of become together in the same room. Some of them
Each
hadn't
other.
been in the
Yeah.
same room for decades, and so it was just cool. It was just a fun kind of more like light side of the ring, if you will, kind of more like the wild side of the ring, but
Yeah.
just kind of a way to try something totally different, and yeah, to be able to spotlight just this era that we really are obsessed with, which is the territory era.
I think my favorite part of Tales from the Territories was Ken Patera in the AWA episode, and Jim Brunzell just calling him out for lying. Like, he's like, "Look, Kenny, I love you, but shut up." Like,
Yeah.
you're full of it.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, that was the very first episode we actually filmed for the series,
oh wow.
and we were like, okay, this is going to be real fun, because we didn't know if it would work. I mean, we really didn't know if the round table thing would work. And it was kind of the thing that a lot of people were not so excited about, from the the powers that be side in terms of greenlighting it. It was kind of like, because a lot of roundtable things, it's like it's high stakes, because you're at the mercy of how a conversation is going to go
Right.
versus how a interview is going to go. And it was tough, man. I mean, it was really hard, because I'm more used to just having to field and air traffic control one interview to keep it on course, but to keep 5 big personalities on board, especially at Ken Patera, it was a little tricky. And I was air traffic controlling all those
Oh,
roundtables, and it was
gosh.
tough. It was tough. Yeah, I got eaten alive and ribbed, and yeah, it was bad, but it
Very
was fun.
good. We're going to move on to something we call the 3 count now. It's going to be 3 quick questions and your answers. First
Oh
question: is
boy.
there anyone in wrestling you think would be incapable of having a dark side of the ring made about them, and who?
That's a good question. Oh my God. Is it bad that I can't think of anybody?
The first one I was
uh,
thinking of was like Tito Santana.
okay. Yeah.
Like, real clean living wrestler. Kids went to Ivy League schools, became a Spanish teacher after he retired. Like, there doesn't really seem to be a lot of public dirt on Tito Santana.
That's a good, safe answer. And it's not because I'm immediately thinking about the nicest people in wrestling, right? Like, I'm thinking about the people who just everyone loves. They can't say a bad thing about a Mick Foley or something like that. But then again, I it flashes from my eyes, or it's he's done so much physical harm to himself
He
and
could do
probably
one.
created
Yeah.
a lot of concern and worry for his family, that I don't know, maybe there's an argument to be made. Yeah, I mean, dang, that's a tough one. That is yeah, I'd have to really think about that, because also there are episodes you know um that we've talked about, and I don't want to say now because we might eventually do them in the future,
Right.
but there are some that we've thought there's no way there's a dark side about blank, and then you kind of look, and it's like, well, maybe it's not that the person got wound up down a path of drugs, or whatever, killed somebody, or whatever. It's actually, maybe the darkness is more subjective in the idea that they died young, and they left a family behind, and a lot of people can relate to that, and that's
Right.
so it's tough, man. I'm gonna steal yours, man. I don't know. Tito Santana.
Now we got to look in. Unfortunately for Tito, we have to look in the dark side of Tito Santana now. So, next question: is there an interview you've wanted to get as long as this show has been on that you haven't been able to? And is there a particular one you were surprised to get?
Okay, the surprise to get is Jerry McDevitt for sure.
I liked that one a lot, by the way.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, Jerry McDevitt, for those who don't know listening, is basically WWE and Vince McMahon's longtime attorney. He's kind of been at the center of most of their larger controversies over the and legal matters over the past several decades. Definitely was that was in the big Hail Mary long shot category in terms of when we came up with the idea. It was basically we wanted to do the steroid trials episode so bad, but it was like, how do you do it? None of the other attorneys wanted anything to do with it, and I was like, well, what if we did it with Jerry, and we kind of built it around Jerry, and that might be interesting. And called him up, called his office up. He called me back, and we were able to eventually work something out, which I did not believe at all would ever happen. So, and he really liked the episode too, and he thought it was really good, and everything we talked about and sketched out ahead of time played out exactly how we wanted it to, and so it was great. One I haven't been able to get. Would it be weird to say Vince McMahon?
No, not at all. I think he's probably the key to a lot of them.
I always had like this fantasy about like season 7, and then the promo for it is just Vince sitting in the dark side chair.
Nice.
I've
often wondered if I ever interviewed him, what the heck I would even ask him. Like, where do you start?
I don't know. I mean, to me, I would probably want to start early on, like, yeah, like, I mean, I know that Vince McMahon documentary is in the works, and, the Netflix one, I'm very interested to
if it ever happens.
If it happens, I'm very interested to see like anything more on who Vince really is fascinating to me. So Vince. Yeah.
And then the last question, since we didn't totally touch on it, what does your fandom of wrestling look like, both past and present?
Yeah. It's evolved over the process of the show. I mean, when I was a kid, I was obsessed, from, the late 80s, early 90s, like, Hulkamania. Like I came in right at the Sergeant Slaughter, Hulkamania, WrestleMania. That's where I came in. I was a big G.I. Joe fan, so I loved, I loved Sergeant Slaughter. I went to my first wrestling show. I begged my parents to take me because I loved, the G.I. Joe, Sergeant Slaughter. And then, of course, I did not understand that he was, an Iraqi sympathizer. And my family thought there was, something wrong with me and how I was cheering for him and not the all-American hero. And I actually cried when Hulk Hogan won. I cried, or, when he was over in the match. Then I got into, the Attitude Era big time, just huge fan. And then ECW blew my mind, in the late 90s, early 2000s. And then I got out of it for a while, and then I started to get back into it with like nostalgia. And that really kind of led to Dark Side of the Ring. Was like, okay, I was producing docs at the time and just really, really, really just upset, wanted to get back to that feeling of being into wrestling again. And it kind of led to the show. But today, with the show, it's like, because wrestling is my day job. I mean, it is now. It has been for 7 years. It's I have to separate it. Like I don't keep up with it as much anymore. And besides, I hate to say this, but it's true. I watch it and it's just not the same. It's just not the same to me. And I hate the way it's filmed. I don't know. Is that really petty of me to say? Like, I hate the way the production of modern wrestling is.
Interesting.
It's like big, bright lights and, and their costumes. Guys, get some better costumes, man. It's not 2002 Hot Topic anymore. Like, get some better costumes. But it's just been hard for me, to watch it because it's just not been the same, and so I don't keep up with it as much. But what I will do is I'll go down like a rabbit hole. Like during the pandemic, I went like crazy over FMW. Like I went through all the FMW like top 100 matches.
Interesting.
And was like, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen in my entire life. Like, it's just, the matches are incredible. The production value is amazing. The drama, the emotion, the crying, every match ends in both wrestlers crying and holding each other. It's amazing. It's amazing. And so I'll do those detours, but with the modern stuff, it's harder for me. Sometimes I'll check in. Like WrestleMania, I thought was really good this year. Mm-hmm. Like I did like I'll watch a WrestleMania and like be like, yeah, that was great. That Charlotte Flair match was like one of the best things I'd ever seen in a long time. So that will happen occasionily.
But you don't need to catch up with it episodically anymore.
I'm not watching Raw. No, you'd have to strap me down to watch that.
Nice. Well, Evan, thank you so much for joining me today. Just want to remind everybody, Dark Side of the Ring begins its new season Tuesday, May 30th on Vice. How many episodes this season is it?
10.
10 episodes.
10. Yep, 10 episodes.
Really looking forward to it. Checked out the Chris Candido, Tammy one, and all the best to you guys for everything you're doing.
Thanks. I appreciate that, man. That's awesome. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.